It was the fall of 2022 when the city of Austin, Texas, began to cool down from the summer heat. The crisp air carried with it a sense of change, not just in the weather but in the lives of the people who called this bustling city home. In the heart of it all, David Carter stood as a pillar of strength, both literally and figuratively. As the proud owner of Carter Strength, one of the most successful gyms in the city, David had built his empire on discipline, determination, and physical perfection. His physique, a testament to years of dedication, was his calling card, a symbol of his success and his identity. Every morning, David arrived before dawn, running through grueling workouts and meticulously planning the future of his business. But despite the success, something was missing, something he couldn't quite name, something that he refused to acknowledge. At home, Lena Carter, his wife of 5 years, sat alone in their spacious kitchen, her gaze lingering on the coffee cup in front of her. The soft morning light filtered through the windows, casting long shadows across the room, but Lena barely noticed. Her once vibrant life, filled with laughter and love, had become a silent routine. Lena was beautiful, sharp-witted, and supportive, but she was drowning in a sea of neglect. She had always been the woman behind David, cheering him on from the sidelines, admiring his work ethic and his ambition. She took pride in his achievements, but what no one saw was the loneliness she carried with her every day. When they first married, their love was electric, passionate, a fierce connection that made her feel alive. But now, months turned into years, and the distance between them only grew. David was always at Carter Strength, always preparing for another competition, always consumed with building his empire. What was once their shared dream had now become his obsession, and Lena was just a bystander, watching as the life she once knew slipped away. She missed him. She missed his touch, his attention, the way he would whisper sweet words in her ear at night. Now, she was lucky if they even had a real conversation. Most nights, she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, waiting for sleep to pull her under, wondering where everything went wrong. It was in those quiet moments of solitude, when she felt the weight of her unspoken desires, that Lena made the decision to do something she never thought she would. She would take control of her life, if only for a moment. In the early hours of the morning, when the world was still asleep, Lena found herself pulling on a pair of workout clothes and driving across town. She had signed up for a gym membership at Powerhouse Fitness, a rival gym to David's, owned by a man named Ethan Brooks. Ethan was everything David wasn't: charming, attentive, and, most importantly, present. He ran his gym with a sense of community and personal connection that Lena hadn't experienced in years. When she first walked into Powerhouse, she was greeted with a warmth that made her feel seen, something she hadn't felt in a long time. And Ethan made her feel special. The first few visits to Powerhouse Fitness were innocent enough. She went in, got her workout in, and left. But each time, Ethan's presence lingered longer in her thoughts. He would approach her after class, offering advice on her form, complimenting her on her dedication. His compliments were genuine, something she hadn't heard in ages. They began to talk more, casually at first, about fitness, life, the weather, but there was always an undercurrent of something more. Something Lena couldn't deny. It didn't take long before their conversations grew longer, deeper. Ethan listened to her, really listened, in a way that David never had. He paid attention to the things she said, the little details about her life, her thoughts, her dreams. Ethan made Lena feel valued, cherished. For the first time in years, she felt like someone was seeing her for who she truly was, beyond the surface of being a wife, a caretaker, a shadow in her own life. And then, one evening after a workout, he offered her something more, a drink. Just a casual drink, he insisted. They went to a nearby bar, and the conversation flowed effortlessly. Lena laughed, truly laughed, for the first time in what felt like forever. Ethan's eyes were always on her, not in a way that felt overbearing, but in a way that made her feel like she was the most important person in the room. She began to crave his attention, his praise, the way he made her feel alive again. That night, when she returned home, the house felt colder than usual. David was already in bed, his back turned to her, his mind clearly elsewhere. She lay there, next to him, but it was as if they were worlds apart. Her heart was racing, not from guilt, but from the excitement of what she had just experienced. She couldn't help but wonder, could this be the escape she so desperately needed? Over the next few weeks, Lena's visits to Powerhouse Fitness became more frequent. Ethan's presence in her life grew stronger, and with each meeting, she felt more and more drawn to him. She knew she was walking a dangerous line, but for the first time in years, she felt wanted, needed. She felt powerful in a way she hadn't felt since before her marriage to David. But she also felt a growing sense of unease. What was she doing? What was this relationship with Ethan becoming? And most importantly, what would happen if David found out? As the weeks passed, Lena found herself more and more entangled in Ethan's world, in a way she could never have predicted. She was crossing a line she never thought she would cross, but the pull was undeniable. The question now wasn't whether she would continue down this path, but how far she would go before the life she had built with David came crashing down. This is just the beginning of Lena's journey as she grapples with her desires, her guilt, and the lure of a new, thrilling connection with Ethan. The rest of the story will unravel in twists and turns, as Lena finds herself caught in a web of deception, longing, and betrayal. The chill of winter had settled over Austin by December 2022, and the once lively streets, filled with the sounds of city life, now seemed quieter. The holidays were fast approaching, but Lena found little joy in the season. The festive lights that adorned homes only seemed to emphasize the emptiness she felt within herself. She had tried, unsuccessfully, to create the holiday spirit in her home, but each night, as she sat alone, she couldn't help but feel disconnected from everything, especially David. It had been over a month since Lena had first crossed the line with Ethan. The affair, though still relatively innocent in its early stages, was beginning to consume her thoughts. Each time she stepped into Powerhouse Fitness, it felt like a small rebellion against the life she had built with David. The gym, with its youthful energy and vibrant sense of community, seemed like a different world, one where she could finally feel seen, valued, and alive. Ethan had noticed the shift in her from the very beginning. He had always been kind, attentive, and supportive of her fitness goals, but now, his glances lingered a bit longer, his words more charged with meaning. He began to talk to her not just about her workouts, but about her life, her struggles, her dreams. He made her feel important in ways David hadn't in years. He saw her, truly saw her, and it was intoxicating. Their conversations moved beyond the gym, spilling into evenings where they would meet at local cafes or quiet bars. At first, it felt harmless. Casual, even. But over time, those casual chats became something more. Lena could feel herself being pulled deeper into Ethan's world, a world where she was more than just a wife, more than just a partner to someone who had lost interest in her. One evening in early December, after an intense workout session at Powerhouse, Ethan invited her out for a drink. Just one drink, he insisted. I promise it'll be a short one. No pressure. Lena hesitated, the weight of the lie she was living hanging heavy on her shoulders. But in that moment, the thought of returning to an empty house, to the silent, disconnected space between her and David, was unbearable. So, she agreed. They sat across from each other in a dimly lit bar, the hum of conversation swirling around them. Ethan's gaze never left her. She could feel the tension between them, charged with something more than just physical attraction. He leaned forward, his voice low, as he spoke to her like no one else had in years. You deserve more than what you're getting at home, Lena, Ethan said, his eyes searching hers. I can see it. The way you carry yourself. You're not just a wife. You're a woman with your own dreams, your own desires. Don't let anyone, even David, make you forget that. Her heart raced as she listened to him. The truth of his words resonated in a way she wasn't prepared for. She had always known something was missing, but hearing it spoken out loud made it undeniable. David had been so absorbed in his career, his gym, his competitions, that he had forgotten to see her, truly see her, for the woman she was. For the first time in months, Lena felt alive. The weight of years of emotional neglect lifted, replaced by a rush of adrenaline, excitement, and desire. Ethan wasn't just giving her attention, he was giving her validation. He made her feel beautiful, wanted, and, most of all, seen. As the evening wore on, the conversation grew more intimate, their words slipping into flirtation. The lines between what was acceptable and what wasn't blurred. When Ethan reached across the table and gently brushed his fingers against hers, Lena didn't pull away. Instead, she felt a spark of something she hadn't experienced in a long time. "You don't have to pretend anymore," Ethan whispered, his voice almost a promise. "I'm not asking you to leave him. I'm not asking for anything except for you to feel what I feel. I just want to give you the attention and love you deserve." Lena felt a shiver run through her at his words. The temptation was undeniable, a hunger she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. But a small voice in the back of her mind reminded her of the vows she had taken with David, vows she had yet to break, even though her heart was already starting to stray. She excused herself from the table, her head spinning with confusion and desire. That night, she returned home to David, the weight of her decisions settling into her chest. David was already asleep when she crept into their bed. She lay there, staring at the ceiling, the image of Ethan's face burned into her mind. Her heart ached with guilt, but there was also a stirring inside her, a pull that she couldn't ignore. In the weeks that followed, the affair with Ethan grew deeper, more entangled. Their meetings became more frequent, their conversations more intimate, their touches more daring. Lena began to lie to David, telling him she was going to the gym or running errands, when in fact, she was with Ethan. And each time she returned home, the guilt gnawed at her, but so did the exhilaration. David, meanwhile, had noticed the changes in Lena. Her distracted demeanor, her coldness when they were together. He didn't understand it at first. He thought it was just stress, or perhaps the pressures of the holiday season. But as December turned into January, something shifted within him. He couldn't put his finger on it, but the more Lena pulled away, the more he felt something was wrong. He would come home late from work, finding Lena sitting on the couch, staring blankly at the TV. Her smile was absent, her eyes distant. David tried to reach out, but it was like she wasn't there anymore, not in the way she used to be. And then, there were the little things, the missed calls, the texts that went unanswered, the late-night workouts at Powerhouse Fitness that turned into hours spent away from him. David's gut told him something was off, but he couldn't bring himself to confront Lena. He wasn't ready to face the truth of what might be happening. So, he buried himself further into his work, pushing the discomfort down, not wanting to believe that his wife was slipping away from him. But the more Lena grew closer to Ethan, the further David fell into the shadows of his own life. The foundation of their marriage was crumbling, and neither of them could see the destruction coming, not yet. Lena, in her secret meetings with Ethan, had crossed a point of no return. What began as a harmless escape from her neglected marriage had now become a full-blown affair, and with each passing day, the web of lies grew tighter around her. She couldn't walk away from Ethan, even as the guilt threatened to consume her. What had started as a spark of something new, something exciting, was now a force that could destroy everything she had once loved. And the truth was, Lena wasn't sure she could stop. By the time winter had fully settled in, Austin seemed to have lost its warmth, and so had Lena's relationship with David. The quiet hum of the holiday season felt suffocating, each passing day filled with more silence than the last. Lena had never imagined that her life would unfold this way, stuck between two worlds, torn between the man she had vowed to love and the man who had made her feel alive again. Each moment with Ethan felt like a stolen treasure, a forbidden joy that Lena knew she couldn't keep forever. And yet, every moment she spent with David, the man she had promised herself to, felt increasingly hollow. It had been weeks since the first kiss with Ethan, and the guilt weighed heavily on Lena's chest. She would lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling, her thoughts a storm of conflicting emotions. She had always believed in love, in the sanctity of marriage, but here she was, standing on the edge of something she couldn't quite grasp, a forbidden relationship that both thrilled and tormented her. Each meeting with Ethan felt like a sin, yet it was the only thing that made her feel alive. One evening, as Lena walked home from yet another clandestine meeting with Ethan, she could feel the heavy weight of the lies she had told David. The guilt gnawed at her, her conscience screaming at her, but there was also a rush of exhilaration, a strange sense of power that came from the deception. Ethan made her feel wanted, seen, cherished in a way that David hadn't done in years. With him, Lena was more than just a wife, she was a woman in her own right, someone who was desired, who was worth fighting for. But as she approached her front door, the familiar weight of reality set in. David was at home, likely already asleep, as he always was after a long day at the gym. His back would be turned to her, and his world would be the same as it had always been, consumed by his business, his gym, his career. And Lena. Lena would slip into her role as the dutiful wife, the silent observer of a marriage that no longer felt real. The door creaked open, and she stepped inside, closing it softly behind her. The house was eerily quiet, and she could hear David's slow, steady breathing from the bedroom. She stood in the hallway for a moment, trying to steady her emotions. The guilt was overwhelming, but so was the pull to Ethan, the draw of his world. She hated herself for what she was doing, but she couldn't seem to stop herself. As she undressed and crawled into bed beside David, she felt the familiar pang of distance between them. He was here, but he wasn't really here. He never truly was anymore. They hadn't had a real conversation in weeks, and every attempt at intimacy was met with silence or an excuse. Lena missed the man she had once married, the man who had looked at her with admiration and desire. Now, all she felt was the ache of being invisible to him. Lena? David's voice broke the silence, pulling her from her thoughts. She turned to face him, her heart racing. Yeah? He studied her for a moment, his brow furrowed. Are you okay? You've been distant lately. Lena's heart skipped a beat. She couldn't look him in the eye, knowing that if she did, he would see the truth in her gaze, the truth she wasn't ready to confront. I'm fine, she lied, forcing a smile. David nodded slowly, though Lena could tell he wasn't convinced. But he didn't press her. He never did anymore. Instead, he turned his back to her, and the distance between them grew even wider. She closed her eyes, but sleep wouldn't come. Not tonight. As the days passed, Lena found herself caught in a constant battle between her loyalty to David and the intoxicating pull of her affair with Ethan. Every time she saw Ethan, her emotions became more tangled. There were moments when she felt like she was losing herself, slipping deeper into a world of lies and betrayal. But then there were other moments where she felt powerful, desired, and in control, like a woman who had finally reclaimed something she had long lost. Her relationship with Ethan had grown more intense, more passionate. Their secret meetings had become something more than just stolen moments of pleasure, they were her escape, her refuge from a marriage that felt more like a prison every day. Ethan's touch, his kisses, they awakened something in Lena that she had forgotten even existed. With him, she could be free. She could be the woman she had always wanted to be, the woman who was loved not out of duty but out of desire. But with each stolen moment, the guilt grew. Lena knew she was walking a dangerous path, one that could lead to the destruction of everything she had ever known. She loved David, at least, she thought she did. But the love she once felt for him had been replaced by resentment, by frustration, by a deep, aching need for something more. And Ethan was the answer, the escape. She couldn't stop seeing him. She couldn't stop feeling the way she did when they were together. The more she saw Ethan, the more she began to question everything about her marriage to David. Was it truly love that kept her with him, or was it simply comfort, familiarity? She couldn't deny that she had once loved David, but now, her feelings were clouded by the raw, unfiltered emotions that Ethan stirred in her. Lena found herself torn between two men, two worlds, both of which were pulling her in different directions. On one hand, there was David, the man she had promised to be with forever. He was kind, loyal, and hard-working, but he was emotionally absent, consumed by his gym and his ambitions. On the other hand, there was Ethan, bold, passionate, and alive. He made her feel wanted, valued, and, most of all, free. The more Lena tried to push away the feelings for Ethan, the stronger they became. It was as if a part of her was now addicted to the excitement, the thrill of being desired and pursued in a way she hadn't been in years. And yet, every time she returned home to David, the guilt gnawed at her soul, reminding her that she was betraying the man she had vowed to be with, the man who had once been her world. She couldn't keep living like this, torn between the man she had married and the man who had awakened something new inside her. But the harder she tried to make a choice, the more she realized that there might be no going back. The web of lies had already been spun, and there was no easy way out. As winter deepened into early 2023, Lena's double life began to grow more complicated. The excitement of her affair with Ethan had escalated into something she could no longer control. Every meeting, every stolen moment felt like a dangerous game that she was playing against herself, and against David. But there was a part of her that no longer cared about the consequences. The affair, once a simple escape, had transformed into an all-consuming addiction. Lena began to rationalize her actions more and more, convincing herself that her emotional neglect from David justified everything. She would tell herself that she wasn't really doing anything wrong, she was just seeking the affection, the attention, the love that David had stopped giving her. Ethan, on the other hand, saw her, truly saw her, and in his eyes, she wasn't just a wife or a mother or a forgotten woman. She was a person with desires, with needs, with passions that deserved to be fulfilled. Their secret meetings became more frequent, each encounter more intense than the last. They would steal time together in the hidden corners of Austin, in the quiet hours when the city was asleep. Each kiss from Ethan felt like a spark, igniting a fire that Lena knew she couldn't extinguish. But each time she returned home to David, a small part of her crumbled. The guilt weighed heavily on her, but the pull to Ethan was stronger than ever. She couldn't stop herself, and worse yet, she didn't want to. David, oblivious to his wife's growing emotional distance, became more engrossed in his gym and bodybuilding career. Carter's strength had reached a level of success that demanded his full attention. His early mornings, late nights, and endless hours of preparation for competitions consumed him. As the gym grew, so did David's obsession with it. He no longer saw Lena's dissatisfaction. She had become a ghost in their home, a shadow of the woman he had married. But the cracks in their relationship were becoming more obvious, even if David refused to acknowledge them. Lena was becoming more distant, more withdrawn, and David was too consumed by his business to notice. The few times they did interact, it was as if they were strangers. Conversations were brief, and when they did talk, it was only about logistics, schedules, meetings, clients, competitions. There was no room for love, no room for understanding. Then, one evening, David noticed something he couldn't ignore. Lena had come home later than usual, but it wasn't the first time. What caught his attention, however, was the expression on her face. It wasn't just exhaustion, it was something deeper, something more telling. Her eyes were darting around the room, avoiding his gaze, as if she was hiding something. Her behavior had changed. She wasn't the same Lena he had married. David's suspicion, long simmering in the back of his mind, flared to life. Something was wrong. He just couldn't place it. He knew his marriage had been distant, but he hadn't realized how far Lena had drifted until now. The truth began to settle in, slowly creeping up on him. She was hiding something. A small voice inside him whispered that it might not just be a new workout routine or stress. His gut told him it was something more. Unable to ignore his growing unease, David took a step he never thought he would. He hired a private investigator. The thought of tracking his wife's every move felt like an invasion of privacy, but the idea of continuing to live in ignorance was worse. He needed answers. The investigator began following Lena, tracking her routines and documenting her whereabouts. At first, it was simple enough. She would leave the house in the early morning for her workouts, and later return with a tired smile, telling David she had been at Powerhouse Fitness. But soon, the investigator began to uncover inconsistencies. There were nights when Lena didn't come home until after midnight. There were days when she said she was meeting friends, but the investigator found her at a quiet bar with Ethan. The truth was becoming clearer, and the pieces began to fit together in a way that left David shattered. One evening, after a long day at the gym, David came home to find Lena in the living room, lost in thought. His suspicion had reached a boiling point, and he couldn't contain it any longer. His voice was firm, his eyes locking with hers. "Lena," he began, his voice strained, "I need to know what's going on. You're not the woman I married anymore. You've been distant, cold. And I know something's wrong." Lena froze. Her heart pounded in her chest, the weight of the lies crushing her. She had thought she could keep the two worlds separate, but David's piercing gaze made it impossible to keep up the charade. "I don't know what you're talking about," she replied, her voice trembling. It was a lie, but it was the only one she could muster. Her heart was racing, and she could feel the pressure building inside her. David didn't buy it. He didn't need to hear the truth from her, he already knew. The investigators' reports, the mounting evidence, it all pointed to the same conclusion. Lena was having an affair. His voice shook with anger as he said, "I know about Ethan." Lena's blood ran cold. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Her body went numb, her mouth dry, and for the first time in a long while, she felt truly caught. The weight of the truth slammed into her like a tidal wave. David's face was a mask of betrayal and hurt, his eyes no longer filled with the love and admiration they once shared. "How long, Lena?" he demanded, his voice barely above a whisper. "How long has this been going on?" Tears welled up in Lena's eyes, but she didn't speak. There was nothing left to say. The affair, once a secret she held tightly to, was now laid bare in front of the man she had promised to love forever. The truth had shattered everything. David turned away, his back to her, his fists clenched. Lena stood frozen, feeling the weight of her choices crushing her. The life she had once known, the life she had built with David, was slipping away, and it was her doing. As the truth sank in, Lena realized the consequences of her actions had finally arrived. There would be no more hiding, no more lies. The affair, the love she had found in Ethan, had come at a steep price. And she wasn't sure if she could afford it anymore. David's voice broke the silence, his words cutting through the tension. "I want you to leave." The weeks following David's discovery were suffocating. The atmosphere in the house had become thick with tension, and Lena could hardly breathe. She had never imagined it would come to this, the moment when the truth was laid bare, and the foundation of everything she had known and built with David began to crack beneath her. She knew the consequences of her actions had finally caught up with her, but even then, she wasn't sure how to stop. David's reaction had been swift and final. When he told Lena to leave, there was no anger in his voice, no shouting. His words were flat, cold, as if the hurt he felt had extinguished the fire within him. The silence that followed each of his statements was deafening. Every look he gave her, every word that slipped from his lips, made Lena feel as though she was a stranger in her own home. But what hurt most was that David's trust in her, something so deeply ingrained in their relationship, had been shattered. And that trust, once broken, was something that couldn't be easily mended. Lena knew that. The bond between them, once so firm, had loosened, and now there was nothing left to hold them together. The affair with Ethan had become an anchor, something Lena could cling to in the midst of the chaos she had created. Ethan, with his intoxicating words and steady presence, seemed to offer her everything she had been missing in her marriage. The more she thought about it, the clearer it became. Ethan had become a symbol of what she truly wanted, of the life she had dreamed of, free from the constraints of a marriage that no longer fulfilled her. He had made her feel important, alive, desirable in a way that David had forgotten how to do. But there was still a part of her that could not escape the guilt, a voice that whispered at night, reminding her of the vows she had taken. She was torn, caught between two worlds. Ethan made her feel wanted, but David had once been the man she loved, the man who had been her world. The days following their confrontation were filled with nothing but silence, punctuated by awkward, strained conversations. Lena stayed in the house, but only physically. Her mind was far away, lingering on the decisions she had made. She could feel Ethan's presence in her life like a quiet storm, waiting for her to make a choice, but not just any choice. He had already made it clear, if she was going to be with him, she would need to leave David behind. Ethan's manipulation had been subtle at first, but now it was becoming harder to ignore. His words, at once comforting and persuasive, played on Lena's vulnerabilities. He made her feel as if the only way to escape the life she had built with David, a life now filled with regret, was to embrace the future he promised her. The life of freedom, love, and desire that she had been craving for so long. He would often remind her that David was emotionally unavailable, that he didn't deserve her, that she was worthy of so much more. "You can't go back now, Lena," Ethan would say softly, his fingers brushing against her arm, sending a shiver through her body. "What you and David had, it's broken. I know you think you owe him something, but you don't. You owe it to yourself to be happy." Those words, those promises of a better future, made it harder and harder for Lena to even consider going back to David. Ethan had a way of twisting her perception of reality, making her feel that the love she shared with David was an illusion, a faded memory that didn't hold up to the passion and connection she felt with him. Every word he spoke seemed to reinforce the idea that her marriage had never been enough, that it was David's fault that she was lost. The night before her final decision, Lena sat in the dimly lit living room, the weight of her choices pressing down on her chest. David had given her an ultimatum, to either come clean, to give him the truth, or leave him. But even as she sat there, contemplating the consequences of both paths, a dark sense of dread settled over her. Could she really walk away from everything she had known, from the man she had vowed to love forever? Was the love she shared with Ethan enough to justify tearing her life apart? As the night wore on, Lena's thoughts grew darker, more intense. She imagined a future with Ethan, a future where she was free, where she could finally feel the love and validation she had longed for. She pictured herself with him, away from the house, away from the suffocating silence of her marriage. But then, a wave of guilt crashed over her, and she found herself questioning everything. Was she really willing to sacrifice everything for a love that was built on lies? The next morning, David asked her again, his voice soft but firm. "Lena, I need you to decide. Do you want to try and fix this? Or is it over?" The question hung in the air like a heavy weight. Lena's heart raced as she stood there, caught between two worlds, two futures. She wanted so desperately to turn back time, to repair the bond with David, to fix the mistakes she had made. But the pull to Ethan, to the life he offered, was undeniable. I can't," Lena whispered, her voice breaking. "I can't fix this anymore, David." David's face fell, the hurt and betrayal evident in his eyes. But even through the pain, he nodded, as if he had already known the answer. The silence between them deepened, and in that moment, Lena knew she had made her choice. She would leave. The finality of her decision was like a sharp knife in her chest. She was choosing Ethan, the love that had swept her off her feet, the excitement, the validation. But in doing so, she was also choosing to walk away from everything she had known. From David. From the life they had built. And that, more than anything, left a void that no one, not even Ethan, could fill. As Lena packed her things, her heart heavy with the weight of what she was leaving behind, Ethan's voice echoed in her mind. He had promised her a future. But now, as she stood on the precipice of her decision, Lena couldn't help but wonder if that future would be everything she had dreamed of, or if it would just be another empty promise. And in that moment, as the door to David's house closed behind her, Lena knew that her life had changed forever. But what she didn't know was whether she had made the right choice, or if the price she had paid for her freedom would be higher than she could ever imagine. The decision was made. Lena had left David, unable to live in the silence of a marriage that had once been filled with so much promise but had long since withered away. Ethan had promised her a new life, one full of freedom, desire, and passion, everything she had been missing for so long. But even as she left, a small voice in the back of her mind whispered doubts she couldn't shake. She had never truly imagined the full consequences of her actions, never realized how much her choices would reverberate through her life. It was a cold morning in late March when Lena received the news. She had only been living with Ethan for a few weeks, still adjusting to her new life. The transition from the life she had known to the one she was now building with Ethan had been jarring, but exciting. They had taken trips together, shared laughter and passion, and for the first time in a long while, Lena felt like she was finally living authentically. She thought she was free, free from David, free from the marriage that had held her captive for so long. But she was wrong. The phone rang as Lena sat at the kitchen counter, sipping coffee. It was an unfamiliar number, one she hesitated to pick up. But then, something inside her told her she had to. Lena, the voice on the other end was steady, but the tone was urgent. It was a detective, and he didn't mince words. There's been an incident. David is dead. For a moment, Lena's world seemed to stop. The words hung in the air like a heavy fog, and it felt as if the ground beneath her feet had disappeared. Dead? David? She couldn't process it. Her mind raced, a whirl of emotions crashing through her. What happened? She finally managed to ask, her voice trembling. It looks like an accident, ma'am, the detective explained. He was found at Carter's Strength early this morning, under a barbell that had fallen while he was lifting. We're still investigating the cause, but it seems to be a tragic mistake. Lena's heart began to pound in her chest. An accident? She didn't know if she believed it. David, alone in the gym, an accident with a barbell? Her stomach twisted in knots. Something didn't feel right. She hadn't seen David in weeks, hadn't spoken to him since she had left, but the weight of the news hit her harder than she expected. The man she had shared her life with, the man she had abandoned, was gone. Are you sure it was an accident? Lena asked, trying to steady her breath. Her mind raced with 1,000 thoughts, none of them making sense. We're still looking into it. We'll need you to come down to the station to answer a few questions, the detective replied before hanging up. The phone slipped from her hand, clattering onto the counter. She sat there, her body frozen, her mind whirling. She didn't know what to feel. Grief? Guilt? Relief? Her emotions were a tangled mess, but one thing was undeniable, David was gone. And she was left to face the wreckage of her choices. Lena stood up, shakily walking to the window, her eyes scanning the city outside, but her mind was elsewhere, lost in the chaos of her thoughts. She had left David, and now he was dead. She didn't know if she could ever come to terms with what had just happened. She had left him for Ethan, for a life she thought would bring her fulfillment. But now, everything felt hollow. Had her departure pushed him to the edge? Was she the cause of this, even if she didn't directly pull the trigger? She couldn't help but wonder. When Lena arrived at the police station, the detective was waiting for her, his face serious. He led her into a small room, where he gently asked her about her relationship with David, about why she had left him, and whether she had any idea if he had been suicidal. The questions were straightforward, but they felt like an invasion of her very soul. She answered as best as she could, but the more she spoke, the more she realized how little she knew. David had been consumed by his work, yes, but she never imagined that it would lead to something as tragic as this. But the detective wasn't done. "We've reviewed the footage from the gym. We have reason to believe there may have been some foul play involved," he said, his eyes narrowing as he studied Lena's reaction. "Did David have any enemies? Anyone who might have wanted to hurt him?" Lena's heart skipped a beat. Foul play? She hadn't even considered it. The gym had always been David's sanctuary, the one place where he could escape, the one place where he could focus. But now, a new fear crept into her heart. Was there someone else involved in David's death? Had he been targeted? She shook her head. "I don't know," Lena whispered, the truth sinking in. She didn't know David's life as well as she thought she did. She hadn't been there to see how his obsession with the gym had taken over, how his drive for success might have alienated those around him. She had seen his isolation, but she hadn't realized it was more dangerous than she ever imagined. The detective continued, "We've also looked into his recent behavior. It seems like he was growing suspicious about something." "About you, Lena." The words hit her like a ton of bricks. David had known. He had known something was wrong, something was off. Had he known about her affair with Ethan? Had his suspicions led him to feel more isolated, more vulnerable? She had no idea, but now, in the cold light of reality, she saw that everything had been spiraling out of control for a long time. David's death, while still officially ruled an accident, began to take on a darker significance. The investigation into the gym's equipment continued, but a small, unsettling detail began to emerge: the weights had been tampered with. The barbell had been set up in such a way that it would have been nearly impossible for David to lift it safely on his own. As the investigation deepened, Lena found herself at the center of a storm that she had never expected. She couldn't escape the guilt, the rising fear that her actions had somehow led to David's death. She had left him, abandoned him, and now she was left to deal with the fallout. She couldn't deny that a part of her felt relieved that she wasn't tied to the marriage anymore, relieved that she could finally be with Ethan. But that relief quickly turned to shame as she realized the gravity of what had happened. David's death had left a void in Lena's life, a void she didn't know how to fill. And even though Ethan was there, promising her a future together, Lena couldn't help but wonder if she had made the right choice. Had she sacrificed everything, her marriage, her life with David, for a love that now seemed just as fragile and fleeting as the life she had left behind? As the investigation continued, Lena realized that the consequences of her decisions were far from over. What had started as an affair, a fleeting escape, had now spiraled into something much darker, something far more tragic. And no matter what happened next, she would have to face the consequences of her choices, a reality that was now inescapable. As the weeks passed, the investigation into David's death intensified, and the calm facade of Lena's new life with Ethan began to crack. What had initially seemed like a tragic accident was slowly morphing into something much darker. The police were not convinced by the simple explanation of a weightlifting mishap. The evidence, or lack thereof, raised too many questions, and the more they dug, the more suspicious the situation became. Lena, despite her best efforts to ignore the growing tension, felt it creeping into every aspect of her life. Ethan, who had promised her a fresh start, a new beginning, could no longer shield her from the reality of her choices. At night, when she tried to sleep, the images of David, dead under the barbell, his lifeless body cold and unmoving, would flash through her mind, along with the gnawing guilt that she could never shake off. The truth, it seemed, was coming for her, whether she was ready for it or not. The police had started to piece together the details of the night of David's death. Their first breakthrough came when they examined the security footage from Carter's strength. It was clear that David had been alone in the gym when the accident occurred, but what struck them as odd was the footage's abrupt cutoff. The cameras had malfunctioned for several minutes during the critical time, just when the incident took place. The footage from the moments before the accident showed David walking into the gym, but it cut off just before the barbell had fallen. When it resumed, David was already trapped beneath the weights, struggling to breathe. The detectives were puzzled. How could the cameras have failed at such a crucial moment? It seemed too convenient to be a mere technical glitch. As they reviewed the footage again, they noticed a subtle detail. The barbell had been set up in a way that made it nearly impossible for David to lift it safely on his own. The weights were positioned in such a manner that, once lifted, the barbell would inevitably fall and crush him. It wasn't long before the police uncovered that the gym equipment had been tampered with. The barbell had been deliberately altered to make it dangerous. This discovery sent shockwaves through the investigation. It was no longer an accident. The detectives now believed that someone had deliberately set David up to fail, and they began to consider the possibility of foul play. Lena was called in for questioning again, but this time, the police weren't asking her to clarify minor details. They were digging deeper. They wanted answers. Sitting in the interrogation room, Lena could feel the weight of her choices pressing down on her chest. The walls felt like they were closing in. She had tried to deny it, tried to move forward and pretend that everything would work itself out, but she knew deep down that it wouldn't. The truth had a way of catching up with you, and now, there was no escaping it. Lena, we've been through the details of your relationship with David, Detective Ellis began, his voice calm but firm. And we've reviewed the evidence from Carter's strength. We know that David was alone in the gym when he died, but the barbell, it was tampered with. It wasn't just a freak accident. Lena's breath caught in her throat. She felt the blood drain from her face, and for a split second, she wanted to stand up and run out of the room. But she couldn't. Her legs felt like lead, her hands trembling as she fought to maintain her composure. I don't know anything about that, she managed to say, though the words felt weak and hollow, even to her. She knew that lying was becoming increasingly difficult. The pressure of the investigation was closing in on her, and she couldn't keep pretending that she wasn't involved. Detective Ellis studied her closely. He wasn't buying her denial. You were close to David, Lena. And you've admitted to us that your marriage was on the rocks, that you were having an affair. Lena's stomach churned at the mention of Ethan's name. Her mind flashed back to the conversations she had had with him, to the moments when he had promised her everything she ever wanted. But she couldn't afford to think about that now. She had to focus on the truth, or the truth that she could still control. I didn't know about the equipment being tampered with. I swear, Lena whispered, her voice cracking. She wished she could believe herself, but she couldn't. The truth was starting to sink in. She didn't just leave David. She had played a part in the unraveling of his life. Detective Ellis paused, letting the silence hang heavy in the room before continuing. Lena, we've been talking to people who know David, and we're starting to piece together a story. David knew something was wrong. He had suspicions about your relationship with Ethan. Did you know that? Lena felt her heart race. The words hit her like a slap in the face. David had suspected. She had known he was pulling away, but she never imagined it was because of what she had been doing behind his back. And now, knowing that he had suspected her infidelity only added to the weight of the guilt she already carried. He hired a private investigator, Lena, Ellis continued, his voice steady. He knew you were seeing someone else. But he had no idea it would lead to this, to his death. Lena's world seemed to tilt, the ground beneath her feet becoming unstable. The realization that David had been so close to uncovering the truth, and yet she had kept him in the dark, made everything seem so much worse. The detectives had already gathered the pieces, and they were putting together a timeline of David's final days. They were now focusing on Ethan. What role did he play in this? Was he part of the plot to murder David? Was he complicit in the tampering of the gym equipment? Or was he just an innocent bystander in this tragic series of events? The thought of Ethan's involvement sent a wave of panic through Lena. She had never considered that he could have had any part in this. He had promised her a new life, a life free from the hurt and betrayal of her marriage. But now, everything was being called into question. Had he manipulated her into a corner? Had he pushed her to the brink of this tragedy, knowing that she would eventually leave David for him? "I need to speak to Ethan," Lena whispered, her voice barely audible. The truth was sinking in, and with each passing moment, the weight of her decisions became clearer. She couldn't hide anymore. She couldn't pretend that her life was just about a simple affair. The reality of what had happened, of David's death, was now undeniable, and Lena was at the center of it all. The investigation was no longer just about uncovering the truth of David's death. It was about unraveling the tangled web of lies, deceit, and manipulation that had led to this tragic end. And Lena was right in the middle of it, with nowhere left to hide. As the detectives continued their questioning, Lena realized that her life would never be the same again. The truth was coming to light, and it was time to face the consequences of everything she had done. Lena sat in the small, sterile interrogation room, her hands trembling slightly on the cold metal table. The questions had become sharper, more pointed, and the silence between her responses felt heavier with every passing second. She had never imagined her life would unravel like this. What had once been a fleeting escape had now engulfed everything: her marriage, her future, her sense of self. David was dead. Ethan's role in all of this was still unclear, but Lena knew the answer to one thing: she was responsible, at least in part, for the chain of events that had led to this point. The detective's voice broke through her spiraling thoughts, his tone serious and steady. "Lena, we've reviewed the evidence. We know about your affair with Ethan. We know that David had his suspicions, but what we don't understand is why you didn't come forward sooner. What were you thinking when you left him?" Lena struggled to find the words. She couldn't answer him with simple excuses. The truth was, she had felt suffocated in her marriage to David. She had loved him once, but somewhere along the way, the love had faded. Ethan had been the escape, the breath of fresh air that she thought would save her. But now, as she sat here facing the consequences, she saw the enormity of the mistake she had made. She had betrayed not only her husband but herself. "I thought I was doing the right thing," Lena whispered, barely able to meet the detective's gaze. "I thought I was choosing my happiness. But now I don't know." Her voice cracked, and she couldn't stop the flood of emotions that followed. Guilt. Regret. Fear. Detective Ellis leaned in, his eyes studying her with a mix of compassion and sternness. "Lena, we're not just investigating David's death. We're looking into the tampering of the gym equipment, the cause of his injuries. We know Ethan was close to you, but right now, we're focused on the bigger picture. We need the truth. Were you involved in David's death?" Lena's heart raced. She hadn't expected it to come to this. She hadn't expected the investigation to uncover everything, every tiny detail of her life. But the truth was, she didn't know what had happened to David the night of his death. She didn't know if Ethan had played any part in it or if it had all been part of a twisted accident. The only thing she did know was that David was dead, and she had walked away from him, abandoning him in his time of need. "I didn't know. I didn't know it was going to end like this," Lena said, her voice breaking. "I just wanted to feel alive again. I never meant for any of this to happen." The detective let the silence linger for a moment, giving Lena the space to gather her thoughts. "We'll need to speak with Ethan next," he said, his voice firm. "There are still too many unanswered questions." Lena nodded, feeling a pang of fear wash over her. Ethan had become a part of her life in a way she never anticipated. He had filled the void left by David, but now, Lena wasn't so sure if the life he promised was the one she truly wanted. Ethan had always seemed so certain of everything, certain of their love, certain that David's death was a result of Lena's unhappiness. But now, as the investigation continued, Lena began to question whether Ethan had manipulated her into making decisions that would eventually destroy everything. The detective's words echoed in her mind as she left the station, "We'll need to speak with Ethan next." She had once believed that leaving David for Ethan was the key to her happiness, but now, in the face of everything that had happened, she felt lost, trapped in a maze of choices that had led to nothing but pain. Days later, as the police brought Ethan in for questioning, Lena sat at home, staring blankly at the walls. Her new life, the one she had been so eager to embrace, had become a prison. She was filled with dread, unable to shake the feeling that the life she had dreamed of would slip through her fingers, just as everything else had. Ethan's interrogation went as expected. He denied any involvement in tampering with the equipment, denying that he had a hand in David's death. But as the detectives pressed him, the cracks in his story began to show. It was clear that Ethan had manipulated Lena's emotions, pushing her to make choices that would ultimately benefit him. But did he push her to the breaking point, to the point where David's death might not have been an accident? The detectives weren't ready to make that call yet, but the pieces were falling into place. For Lena, the truth was slowly becoming clear. She had made a series of choices, each one compounding the last, each one leading her further into a place where redemption seemed impossible. And now, with David's death hanging over her, she would have to face the consequences, not just of her affair, but of the way she had allowed herself to be manipulated, to be caught in a web of lies. As the investigation continued, Lena knew that her life, as she had once known it, was over. The love she had once shared with David, the love she had left behind in search of something better, had now led to a tragic, irreversible conclusion. And now, as she waited for the next chapter in her life to unfold, she couldn't help but wonder, was it all worth it? What do you think of Lena's story? Did she make the right decision by leaving her marriage? Was Ethan to blame for David's death, or was Lena's own guilt the true cause of the tragedy? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what you think. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more gripping true crime stories.